median earnings each year. And while we've made improvements in narrowing the gap over the last 50 years, progress towards closing it has actually slowed and even stalled in recent decades as policy has failed to support women as workers and ensure that equal work is rewarded with equal pay. And not only that, but the top line number doesn't give us the full picture. Black women only earn 63%, Native American women 60%, Latina women only 55% of what men earn. This failure to close the gender wage gap isn't just an issue for women experiencing the pay gap, it's also an issue for their families and for our whole economy. Women's earnings are a crucial component of families' economic security. 2/3 of mothers are either the primary breadwinner or co-breadwinner in their families. And the Institute for Women's Pay Policy Research estimates that if working women receive equal pay with comparable men, that is, men of the same age, the same education, who work the same hours, and who live in similar regions, apples to apples, then poverty for working women would be reduced by more than 40%. This is an issue for our whole economy because women's lost wages translates into lost GDP. 2.8% of GDP to be specific, or even more specific, $541 billion per year. Therefore, if long-term economic growth is our goal, and it should be, then closing the gender wage gap is not just a moral imperative, it's an economic one. If we're to properly address the persistent wage gap, first we have to understand it. So let's look at the root causes. First, economists estimate that half of the gender wage gap is still caused by differences in the types of industries and occupations that women and men work in. For example, men are overrepresented in jobs like construction, software development, and women are overrepresented in jobs such as administrative assistants and cashiers. But while some point to this is evidence that the gender wage gap is due to women making different choices about their careers, the reality is that even within the same industry and the same occupation, women are still paid less than men. As an example, research finds that up to 68% of the gender gap could be closed if men and women were paid equally within occupations. That is, men and women receive. The point to individual characteristics or choices only account for part of the problem. When you add it all up, measurable explanations for the gender wage gap, including differences in occupation and industry, or accounting for education and length of work experience, 38% of the gender gap remains unexplained, which many economists attribute to discrimination. Finally, when seeking to understand the gender wage gap, we cannot ignore the role played by our economy's devaluation of the work that has traditionally been done by women, particularly women of color. Care work is among the lowest paid work in our economy. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that the median pay for home and personal care aides is $27,080 a year, which is barely above the poverty level for a family of four. Perhaps not coincidentally, women of color make up a disproportionate share of care workers. For example, Black women are 13% of the US workforce, but 28% of home care workers. Addressing the gender wage gap will also require a multifaceted approach. No single policy is going to close it, but there are many policies that will help narrow it. Raising wages in low-paying occupations that tend to be dominated by women will provide the greatest benefit to the women in these jobs, while also benefiting all workers. An important way we can do this is by strengthening the minimum wage and improving workers' bargaining power, such as through legislation like the Raise the Wage PRO-X. Gender and racial discrimination are the second largest driver of the gender pay gap. Therefore, policies that address the ongoing role of discrimination in the labor market will be absolutely necessary to make a meaningful difference in the pay gap. The Paycheck Fairness Act is one example of a policy that would make it easier for women to challenge pay discrimination. And finally, we also need policies that help keep women connected to the labor market and moving up the career ladder, such as paid leave and affordable child care. We can't make progress toward narrowing the gender pay gap if we don't make it sustainable for women to remain in the workforce through policies like Building an Economy for Families Act, the Family Act, or the Child Care for Working Families Act, which are aimed at ensuring that all workers are able to take the time they need to care for their families and make sure their children are receiving quality care while they are at work. And this is why I so look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. So now let me turn it over to Senator Lee from the great state of Utah for his opening statement. Senator Lee, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for convening today's hearing on this topic. Women make unique and invaluable contributions to our families, our communities, and to our workplaces. Thankfully, these opportunities for women in the workplace have grown tremendously over time. The female labor force participation rate has doubled over the last 50 years, and American women have not simply joined the workforce, but they've excelled and they've become leaders within it. In fact, the United States has a higher share of female managers than almost every other OECD nation. I myself am fortunate to benefit from the skills and the expertise of my female chief of staff, female legislative director, female chief counsel, and female staff director here on the Joint Economic Committee. So I'm personally grateful for the fruits of women's economic progress and freedom, and I'm also the father of an unbelievably gifted and intellectually curious daughter. For this and so many other reasons, fairly valuing women's important contributions is particularly important to me. The gender pay gap is the topic that brings us here today, and the pay gap is frequently a focal point in conversations about women's labor market experiences. Although the pay gap can tell us some things about women's experiences at work, we know that, like many metrics, the pay gap has limitations. If, as a society, we truly care about supporting and empowering women, then it's crucial that we understand what those limitations are and what this measure can tell us and what it does not tell us. For example, although the pay gap indicates that the average man and the average woman earn different amounts, the headline number doesn't necessarily tell us why this is the case. We know that industry, occupation, years of service, educational attainment, geographic location, and family decisions all matter greatly when it comes to pay. Some of these characteristics vary for the average man and the average woman and contribute in significant ways to the pay gap. One of the largest drivers of the pay gap seems to be that men and women work in different industries and in different occupations. Caretaking responsibilities also play an outsized role. Before the birth of their first child, women make the same on average as men, but afterwards, working mothers' earnings tend to diverge from working fathers' earnings, reflecting on average fewer hours worked and other changes. Although some of women's decisions regarding their education, occupation, industry, and engagement with the labor force may be influenced by cultural pressures and expectations, that is analytically distinct from a conclusion as to whether, to what extent, or in what way employers are discriminating on the basis of gender. Still, women cannot make as many decisions as they should be able to make when it comes to their work life. And government policy needs to get out of the way and allow employers to provide the flexibility that working mothers say they want. A path forward, I believe, lies in policymakers at the federal, state, and local level, removing government barriers that currently limit choice and opportunity for women. Reforming regulations that get in the way of flexible work can greatly increase opportunity. This type of reform would help all workers, but especially working women who surveys indicate prioritize flexibility in order to care for their families. Passing the Working Families Flexibility Act would be a step in the right direction to help women and other workers. For decades, federal labor laws have unfairly restricted working parents in the private sector from choosing either traditional overtime pay or paid time off as compensation for overtime hours worked, even while granting a special exemption for government employees. The Working Families Flexibility Act would correct this disparity to give the same opportunity to all working moms and dads. In addition to passing the Working Families Flexibility Act, policymakers should reform home-based business zoning, which stifles entrepreneurship. While home-based businesses have multiplied in recent decades, currently making up half of all businesses, many remain underground since they're illegal under current law. An incredible 17% of Black women and 10% of white women are entrepreneurs. And so regulatory reform to ease these burdensome rules will be especially helpful in clearing the path for their success. Occupational licensing laws also constitute a major barrier to work, and reform is necessary to eliminate onerous requirements for jobs that can be done with little risk to workers and those they serve. Another area in need of reform is childcare. There are many unnecessary regulations that drive up the cost of care. Some laws impose unnecessary education requirements on daycare workers, or sometimes they increase staff-to-child ratios, making it far more difficult and expensive for families to afford care and preventing some women from working at all. Passing the Child Care Worker Opportunity Act would help address this issue for working moms and child care workers in the Washington, D.C. area. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Paycheck Fairness Act, which yesterday the Senate voted not to take up. If we care about women's long-term success, it seems important that we consider the unintentional impacts that this bill would likely have and how it may result in more rigid compensation structures that could translate into less flexibility in the workplace and fewer of the work arrangements that women and many men value. In addition to reforming regulatory barriers, recent history tells us that growth in opportunities for female workers translates to higher wages, new jobs, and a narrowing of the pay gap. Just in the years before the pandemic, pro-growth policies like lower taxes and regulatory reforms helped sustain a strong labor market for American workers. Women, and especially women of color, benefited the most. They experienced some of the fastest job growth and largest wage gains on record. Rebuilding after the pandemic will be challenging, but we know that markets supported by common sense policies are the best way to support female workers and allow them to build on their decades of progress in the workplace. As we seek to empower women in the workplace, it's essential that we support these pro-growth policies and protect workplace flexibility. I'm hopeful that today's hearing will help us better understand how to meet women's and working mothers' needs and how to develop policies that empower them to continue building on their many achievements. I look forward to hearing the insights of our witnesses on this important topic. Thank you.
Senator Lee, thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce our four distinguished witnesses. Dr. Michelle Holder will be an associate professor of economics at the John Jay College of the City University of New York starting this August. Previously, she has worked professionally as an economist for a decade in both the nonprofit and government sectors. Her research focuses on the Black community and women of color in the American labor market. Her research into the gender wage gap includes work on the double gap that Black women face. Dr. Holder received a master's and doctoral degrees in economics from the New School for Social Research and a bachelor's degree in economics from Fordham University. Dr. Marlene Kim is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and is also a visiting scholar in the economics department at the University of New Hampshire. She specializes in race and gender discrimination in employment, especially the intersection of these and the working poor. Her work has been published widely in journals and books, including editing Race and Economic Opportunity in the 21st Century. She is a recipient of the first Rhonda Williams Prize for her work on race and gender discrimination. Dr. Kim holds a PhD in economics and a BA in economics and English from the University of California, Berkeley. Ai-jen Poo is the co-founder and executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, a nonprofit organization working to bring quality work, dignity, and fairness to the growing numbers of workers who care and clean in our homes, the majority of whom are immigrants and women of color. She is a leading expert in the care economy and how it is increasingly defining the future of work. Ms. Poo has been recognized among Fortune World's 50 greatest leaders and Time's 100 most influential people in the world, and has received numerous awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship. She has a BA from Columbia University and honorary doctorates from Smith College, the New School, and City University of New York. And finally, we have Mrs. Romina Baccia. She's the managing director of Stonebrook LLC. She was previously the director of the Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation, where she oversaw production of the foundation's annual federal budget plan. She also previously served as a policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum covering the gender pay gap. Mrs. Baccia's research is focused on government spending and the national debt. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from George Mason University. So Dr. Holder, let's begin with your testimony, and then we'll continue in the order each of you was introduced. Dr. Holder, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Beyer. Good afternoon to you, to Senator Lee, and distinguished members of the Joint Economic Committee. Thank you for the opportunity today to discuss the gender wage gap. As Chairman Beyer noted, my name is Dr. Michelle Holder. I am an associate professor of economics at John Jay College, City University of New York, as of August of this year. I'm a labor economist by training, and my research does focus on the position and status of the Black community and women in the American labor market. In my remarks today, I will discuss the impact of the gender wage gap on Black women in the US. To do so, I will largely draw on original quantitative research I conducted last year on Black women and the gender wage gap in the economic report, The Double Gap and the Bottom Line, African American Women's Wage Gap and Corporate Profits, which I prepared for the Roosevelt Institute in New York City. The gender wage gap is typically a straightforward comparison of the average or median full-time wages or earnings of all working men in the US to the average or median full-time wages or earnings of all working women in the US. However, the gender wage gap formulation masks complex factors which play a role in the gap, including occupational crowding based on gender, gender socialization, employer bias, historical exclusionary practices on the part of unions, the so-called motherhood penalty, and human capital disparities. One prominent narrative that's been advanced regarding the gender wage gap is that it is not due to discriminatory treatment on the part of employers in this country. Instead, the fault lies primarily with women due to voluntary choices we make. While I do not dispute that women are clearly capable of making informed choices about their careers, what I hope to show is that even when women seemingly do all the things that should result in equitable pay, there are long-held practices in American work life that leave women vulnerable to unequal pay. If we were to rank median or average annual pay in the US by race and gender, women of color, including Black women, would be at the very bottom of that rank. Black women earn the least due to the effects of both what's called the racial wage gap, meaning overall Black Americans on average earn less than white Americans in the US. This is what's called the racial wage gap, as well as the gender wage gap. I term this dual effect the double gap in wages of Black women. According to the National Partnership for Women and Families, Black women earn 61 cents for every dollar non-Hispanic white men earn. The takeaway here is that the gender wage gap has the largest absolute negative impact on the individual earnings of women of color, as Chairman Beyer noted in his opening statements. In original research I conducted using descriptive as well as regression analyses, most of the important factors that could contribute to the earnings differentials between Black women and non-Hispanic white men, such as educational attainment or years of work experience, have been taken into account or controlled for, which means that I compare full-time working Black women and full-time working non-Hispanic white men with similar educational attainment, similar work experience, and many other commonalities with regard to skill sets. Thus, I compare, as Chairman Beyer noted, apples to apples in this analysis of the wage gap between Black women and white men. What I found in my research is that, with few exceptions, non-Hispanic white men earn considerably more than Black women in almost all 22 major occupational categories and almost all 77 minor occupational categories. You all will note that I am comparing Black women to non-Hispanic white men, because if we ranked median or annual earnings by workers according to race and gender, non-Hispanic white men would be at the top of that rank, and Black women would be at the bottom of that rank, along with Native American women and Latinas. For an individual Black female worker, the annual earnings gap does range. It can be as low as $5,000 in some low-wage occupations, or it can be as high as $50,000 to $75,000. This is per year in high-wage occupations. These are annual gap amounts, annual differentials. More and less, on average, I found that in 2019, which was the year of my research, the annual gap in earnings between Black women and non-Hispanic white men range between $10,000 to $20,000 per year for a typical Black female worker in the US. In the aggregate, I estimate that the wages Black women in US, what I term involuntarily forfeit due to the combination of both the racial and wage gaps, amounts to approximately $50 billion per year, a large and reoccurring annual loss to the Black community. Several factors can contribute to the gender wage gap faced by Black women. Factors include Black women's historically subordinate position in the American labor market, the role of networks, differences in college completion rates between Black and white Americans. There is still a large educational attainment gap between Blacks and whites at the level of college completion. Over 35% of non-Hispanic whites have a college degree compared to 25% of Blacks. The use of prior earnings history in determining earnings or wages. In 2018, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case Rizzo versus Jovino, which was subsequently vacated by the US Supreme Court on a technicality. The common practice of requesting previous salary histories from job applicants was found to be discriminatory against women. The lack of wages earnings transparency in the American workforce and in our American culture, and discrimination and bias on the part of employers. These policy approaches, I believe, have the potential to narrow the gender wage gap for Black women in particular. First, passage of state and/or federal laws which prohibit employers from requesting previous salary histories from job applicants. Second, just scrolling. Passage of state and/or federal laws requiring pay transparency in the private sector. Economist Marlene Kim, who is also testifying today, has found that in states where pay secrecy practices are banned, the gender wage gap is lower among highly educated women. Number 3, revision of the EEO-1 form to include compensation data. This form, required to be submitted regularly by employers, already reports the demographic and occupational makeup of most workers in the US, demographic, occupational, and gender. And this data is used by the EEOC to support civil rights enforcement. Under former President Obama, an executive order implemented a revision to the form to include compensation data. Unfortunately, this revision was jettisoned under former President Trump's administration. I and other advocates such as Jocelyn Fry at the Center of American Progress call for this revision to be re-implemented. Number 4, the likelihood of acquiring student debt is a disincentive to attending college. Making tuition free at community and public colleges throughout the US would incentivize more Black women to complete their bachelor's degrees, raising this group's median educational attainment level, which will likely lead to a narrowing of the wage gap this group encounters. And finally, raise the federal minimum wage. The majority of minimum wage earners in the US are women, and proportionally more Black women earn the minimum wage than Black men. Economist Marlene Kim, again, who is testifying today, has found a small but positive effect on the gender wage gap, meaning that it narrows, that would occur by raising the minimum wage. I believe I am out of time.
Yeah, Dr. Holder, thank you very much. Let's move on. We just have your conclusion left, but thank you very much. And it restates it all very well. So we have it in writing also. So thank you, Dr. Holder, very much. So now we'll hear from Dr. Kim from the University of Massachusetts, Boston.
Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Mike Lee, and members of the Joint Committee, thank you for inviting me to this very important hearing. I'm Marlene Kim, a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I've been studying the gender wage gap for 30 years. As my written testimony has shown, we've made great progress in reducing the gender wage gap from 65% to the low 80s today. But progress has stalled for over a decade. Why? Subtle, unconscious biases remain against women. Women with the same qualifications are less likely to be hired, trained, mentored, promoted, and compensated at the same rate as men. Homophily bias explains this. People like to associate with people who are similar to them, so they hire, train, mentor, and promote people who are like them, including by gender and race. This bias directly enters the pay setting process so that occupations held by women are underpaid compared to occupations held by men simply because women perform this work. This occurs in two different ways. First, before gender discrimination was illegal, companies explicitly underpaid predominantly female occupations, and they never remedied this. For example, personnel analysts in the state of California's civil service asked policymakers, should any difference in pay because of sex be made? And they recommended that occupations filled mostly by women be paid less, such as clerical workers. They underpaid predominantly female occupations 22 to 36% less, and some of this underpayment continues today. Research shows that this underpayment of predominantly female occupations was also performed all over the US and all over the world. Second, when establishing compensation systems, companies perform job evaluations to identify occupations with greater value to the firm and pay these more. The problem is that employers usually have separate job evaluations for occupational groups, such as a job evaluation for managers, a separate one for clerical and administrative assistants, and another separate one for engineers. And with occupational segregation, that women and men work in different occupational groups, this means that employers are only comparing predominantly female occupations to other women's occupations in their job evaluations, and predominantly male occupations with other male occupations in those job evaluations. This results in the underpayment of women's jobs becoming embedded in the pay structures. But jobs of comparable value to employers should be paid the same. Therefore, employers should reevaluate their job evaluations and use only one job evaluation for all of their jobs so that women's and men's occupations are evaluated in the same way and with consistent criteria, and jobs of comparable value to employers are paid the same. If you do this, women's earnings increases and you eliminate half of poverty. This is not a far-fetched idea. It's been implemented in Australia, in the public sector in Minnesota, and in cities and school districts across the United States. So I recommend that jobs in the federal sector and jobs with federal contractors be reevaluated in this way. In addition, since women are less likely to be hired, trained, and promoted, additional remedies are needed. We need greater enforcement of anti-discrimination laws and affirmative action. We need to require diversity, sexual harassment, and gender-free bias training in the federal government and for government contractors. It'd be great to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act. This would eliminate pay secrecy, which would reduce the gender wage gap. It would also help with collecting more detailed data on federal contractors so you can discover if the pay of women and men and people of color within occupations differs, and if their hiring and promotion rates differ. And if it's not already there, we should also require more detailed occupational categories in the same EEO-1 form that Dr. Holder mentioned, so that we can evaluate if companies are hiring, training, and promoting women and people of color in their respective numbers. To conclude, the gender wage gap has stalled, but it can be fixed, and you can make a difference in this. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, very much. We'll next hear from Ai-jen Fu, who's the Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And Ms. Fu, one thing I've always been impressed with is these are the jobs most difficult to turn over to robots. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
That's right. There's not yet an algorithm for empathy. Thank you so much, Chairman Beyer and Ranking Member Lee and the members of the committee. It's truly an honor for me to have the opportunity to testify on how we break through the gender wage gap. As Chairman Byers said, I am the Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Founded in 2007, we are the home for the 2.2 million domestic workers who work as nannies, home care workers, and house cleaners in private home settings, providing care and cleaning services. Our community includes over 250,000 domestic workers in all 50 states working to achieve economic security and opportunity. Domestic work is the work that makes everything else possible in our lives. It ensures that we have the ability to go to work and participate in our society and in our economy, knowing that our homes and our families are in good care. It has always been essential work, and yet it has always been devalued and underpaid. The racial and gender wage gaps in our economy are apparent here in the way that this entire workforce, a workforce that is 90% women, majority women of color, and a third immigrant, have been devalued, underpaid, and excluded from the frameworks of our law and policy. The work of care and cleaning has always been associated with women. The fact that we have never adequately valued the care economy means that the whole world of work that has fallen on the shoulders of unpaid women family members and underpaid women of color professionals is invisible. During the New Deal era, Congress enacted the Fair Labor Standards Act to raise wages and the National Labor Relations Act to guarantee employees the right to form unions. However, domestic workers were excluded from these signature New Deal laws as a result of racism. Southern members of Congress refused to support the labor law provisions of the New Deal if they covered domestic workers and also farm workers, who were largely Black workers at the time. That has resulted in the reality that most domestic workers work incredibly hard and still can't make ends meet. They are much more likely than other workers to be living in poverty. The typical domestic worker is paid $12 an hour, or 39.8% less than a typical non-domestic worker who is paid $19.97 an hour. The average annual income of a domestic worker is less than $16,000 per year, as compared to that of $39,000 for non-domestic workers. They don't have job security, a clear work agreement, access to benefits or health care. So the workers that we count on to care for us and our families struggle to take care of themselves and their own families doing this work. The fact that we still refer to this profession as help, as opposed to the skilled profession that it is a reflection of how we have devalued this workforce. With the American Jobs and Families Plan, we can and must address this. We can ensure that home care workers earn a living wage, and we can ensure that this workforce has access to the child care and the paid family and medical leave they need to sustain in their work and care for the people they love. For example, the proposed investment in Medicaid, home and community-based services in President Biden's American Jobs Plan would be transformative to addressing the gender pay gap in at least two ways. First, there is the direct benefit of creating good jobs for the home care workforce. There's a huge demand for this work, and wages are shockingly low, so we have high rates of turnover and home care deserts across the country. As Chairman Byers said, these are jobs that aren't automated and can't be outsourced. This investment is the single highest impact way for us to create good jobs that will go to women and women of color. Second, there is the benefit to the unpaid family caregiver that relies on this workforce. There are 42 million caregivers who work full-time and provide care to an aging loved one or a loved one with a disability, also majority women. This care enables them to work, to have the real option to return to work. And this is particularly important in light of the nearly 5 million women who've been pushed entirely out of the workforce in the pandemic because of caregiving challenges. putting this essential workforce that was excluded from the New Deal because of racism and sexism at the forefront of the largest jobs plan since World War II is a profound opportunity to address the gender pay gap, one that we must seize for this workforce and for all of us. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Pooh, very much. And finally, we'll hear from Romina Baccia from the Stonebridge LLC. Ms. Baccia, the floor is yours.
Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and distinguished members of the committee, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Romina Baccia, and I'm a first-generation immigrant and naturalized American citizen. And I believe in the American dream that ours is a country that provides opportunity for all to make something of themselves with hard work, a little help, and some luck. I was raised by a single mom with a physical disability and mental health problems. We were on welfare for most of my childhood years. I started working to help support our family when I was only 11 years old, and I have been working ever since. I was even a home care worker, caring for individuals with disabilities before going to college. As a woman who today is the sole breadwinner in her family, I personally know how important it is for women to be treated equally in the workplace. I believe everyone, regardless of their gender, should be able to earn their worth based on the value they add and not be subject to unfair discrimination. I also know that neither men nor women necessarily earn what they are worth automatically. We earn what we negotiate. Both market factors outside of our control, such as a recession, and factors at least partially within our control, such as skill levels, affect our negotiating power. On both the employer and the employee side, it matters greatly what alternatives we have available. I have studied the gender wage gap for more than 10 years. It is one of the most misleading policy issues today. Your constituents assume that when we talk about the gender wage gap as evidence for discrimination, we do so by comparing apples and apples, men and women working under the same conditions in the same jobs, putting in the same hours. That is not the case. The gender wage gap, in fact, compares apples and oranges, because when you divide the median wage of all full-time working women by the median wage of all full-time working men, without adjusting for important factors that explain obvious differences in earnings, you inevitably arrive at a highly misleading statistics. Earnings are primarily a function of productivity. Only after accounting for explanatory factors can we reasonably discern whether the gender wage gap is a useful signal alerting us to a problem or a function of men and women making different choices. Some of those important factors include hours worked, and BLS data clearly shows that women work on average 10% fewer hours than men. This holds true even in highly regulated work environments that leave little room for discrimination. We find a gender wage gap. For example, a study examining the earnings of male and female bus and train operators in Massachusetts identified that women earned 89% of what men earned, concluding that, and I quote, while having the same choice set in the workplace, women and men made different choices, end quote. In particular, women chose to work only half as many overtime hours as men and take an average of 17.5 days of unpaid leave compared with men. If women worked more hours than men, at least in this particular setting, we would expect them to earn more than men. There's some hopeful news as well, though. Young women today are earning more university degrees, everything from bachelor's to doctoral degrees than men, and we actually observe a gender wage gap in reverse in major metropolitan areas among college-educated childless women. This changes once women have children and begin to reduce their hours or take more time off from work for caregiving. Women are more likely to interrupt their careers for caregiving, primarily for childcare, but also for elder care. Culture and gender socialization play a role in who takes on these caregiving responsibilities that are so important for households and families. And some countries have tried to take more aggressive measures to equalize leave policies, but public policy is a blunt tool when it comes to what is best referred to as a choice gap. There's also the important role that benefits play, and the fact that women are more likely than men to work in industries that provide more of their compensation in the form of benefits, including in government, education, and nonprofit organizations. Non-cash benefits such as health coverage and paid leave are not taken into account when we look at the raw gender wage gap. We should first diagnose the problem accurately to determine whether public policy is the right tool to address it, or whether there's a problem to address it all. In everything we do, we should also consider the unintended consequences, not merely the intended outcomes of our policy prescriptions. Government mandates or increasing liability for employers, as the Paycheck Fairness Act would do, are most likely to backfire on the very same people those policies are intended to help. The best thing that policymakers can do is to expand choices and create the regulatory conditions that allow our economy to thrive, creating more opportunities for workers, which expands the number of and quality of jobs available to them and increases their negotiating power. I refer the committee to my written testimony for an analysis of various policy proposals to address the gender wage gap and welcome any questions. Thank you.
Ms. Baccia, thank you very much. Now that we've finished with the official testimonies, we'll begin our questioning. I get to go first, and I want to leverage first off of my friend Senator Lee's pointing out about his remarkable daughter, which I very much appreciate. But to talk about my remarkable grandmother only because she was charged by Francis Perkins with standing up the Bureau of Labor Standards in 1933. So it is fun 90 years later to see this come back around for all of you. All the way to the director of our Joint Economic Committee staff, our executive director is Tamara Fusil, another very strong woman leading us in the right direction. So, I've been a boss and employer in the private sector for 45 years. I'm having trouble with this notion of how diminished workplace flexibility is somehow an unreasonable cost for paying women their fair share. Ms. Pu, can you talk to me, number one, about all the benefits that those care workers are getting, the health care benefits and the paid sick leave and all those other things? Is this real at all?
It certainly isn't real in the domestic work context. 82% of domestic workers came into the pandemic without a single paid sick day. And so what we saw was just dramatic losses in jobs and income immediately as the stay-at-home orders came down, because that work is by definition work that has to be done in person. It can't be done remotely. And very few domestic workers have access to healthcare, only 1 in 10. So we have a situation where workers are piecing it together in order to survive and don't have access to benefits or a safety net.
Let me push on one thing. Ms. Baccia pointed out that in a perfect economic world, our wages are determined by our productivity, by our contribution to society. Is there any reason to think that somebody sitting behind a desk in Wall Street is making a greater contribution, or is working harder, or is more productive than somebody taking care of a child or somebody with Alzheimer's?
What I see when I see home care workers and domestic workers at work is essential work that is about meeting the fundamental human needs of our loved ones across the lifespan. I can't think of a more valuable job than nurturing the human potential of our children, or supporting the independence and dignity of a person with disabilities to be able to live a full and whole life in the community, or the dignity and quality of life of our aging parents and grandparents who gave us our quality of life. So I think it's incredibly fundamental and valuable work, and certainly as valuable as people who sit behind a desk in Wall Street.
Thank you. Again, Ms. Baccia had mentioned about some of the pay differential may be because we make different choices. Dr. Holder, do you see people raised in poverty after 400 years of discrimination having the same choices available to them as my children or Senator Lee's children?
It may appear superficially that all women, regardless of race, ethnicity, disability, have the same choices. But in reality, when we talk about class differences, income differences, the likelihood is that because the poverty rate is higher in the Black community, the types of colleges that young Black adults go to may not be as prestigious as the ones that young white adults go to. And that would be the same for young Black women and young white women. So we have free choice, but within a system that is inherently inequitable and has been historically so. And that is what limits our choices.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Kim, you talked about pay transparency. I've always been impressed with the idea that where there is real pay transparency in the federal government, in the military, there is the smallest amount of wage differentiation between men and women. Well, what's wrong with taking that pay transparency idea throughout our greater economy?
I think it would be a great idea to do that. Many countries have a lot more pay transparency than we do. And people certainly should not be fired for asking how much people earn in similar jobs. And that's what the Paycheck Fairness Act would have helped.
One of the things I think that Ms. Baccia mentioned was that employers first look to external equity as they try to set pay rates, but then second, they look to internal equity. And it's the internal equity that we seem to be lacking here. Well, I'm very grateful for all of your comments, that they're terrific. And I'd like to move on to last year's chair of the Joint Economic Committee and a future chair, I'm sure. Senator Lee, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Chairman. Ms. Baccia, I'd like to start with you. You shared some of your personal story with us as part of your testimony. I know that in addition to overcoming a whole lot of obstacles as a first-generation American immigrant, you graduated in economics, somewhat male-dominated field, and then went on to lead an economic research department at a major think tank here in our nation's capital. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience as a professional woman? Tell us a little bit about how you see both the opportunities and the challenges that professional women face.
Thank you, Senator Lee. I think I'm an employer also of women today, and I employed women while I was at the Heritage Foundation. And some of the women I employed who had also several children were some of the most productive employees that I had. And so I don't believe there's anything in gender that would explain pay differences other than different choices and the different experiences that we have. And one thing that we do find is that women find flexibility incredibly important. In my personal experience, I have found that you have to not only work really hard, but you also have to negotiate your worth. And that is something where women do not always advocate for themselves most effectively, which is why I have made it part of my mission to be a mentor to young women, to help them understand the power that they have in the workplace. If they work hard, if they study, if they educate themselves, they can increase their bargaining power, and how they can negotiate not just their wages, but also the conditions under which they work, including flexibility. And some of the examples we heard about the federal government and unionized environments, those are exactly the kinds of rigid environments that don't allow for those differences between men and women, and the flexibility that the different genders value in different ways because of childcare and responsibilities. And so many of the proposals that we heard, like the Paycheck Fairness Act, would impose more of those rigid structures. And we've seen even pay transparency in countries like Denmark. Yes, it has led to a narrowing of the gender wage gap, but at the cost of productivity and at the cost of higher wages for everyone. Men and women were made worse off as a result of this law. So from my personal experience and also from the research that I have done, I believe that men and women get compensated fairly if they advocate for themselves and if the economy provides them with enough options so that if you work for an employer who doesn't recognize your worth, you have the option to find alternative employment. And entrepreneurship is such a key ingredient to that ultimately.
No, thank you. That's helpful. Now, in some testimony you gave to the Republican Policy Committee Working Group back in 2016, I believe, you described some differences in what men and women value and look for and seek out in a career. For example, I believe you noted some findings from a Pew Research study that found that 70% of working mothers in the United States say that they value flexibility in their employment, compared to about 50% of men who said the same thing. You also noted that men value a high-paying career, in many cases more than women do. From your perspective, what is that? Would that say, does that tell us anything about whether that's acceptable for men and women to have different preferences about their work lives than men?
I think we should celebrate and respect those differences that men clearly have. Women do, especially working mother, value flexibility much more highly, and they also value the ability to work part-time much more highly. And men, in part, our society has imposed this on men. Socialization and culture has made it such that we expect men to provide for the family, even though we now have many female breadwinners as well. And those preferences clearly play a role in men, for example, choosing higher risk occupations that reward them for taking those risks and doing unpleasant jobs like working on oil rigs and in construction, more likely so than women, with higher pay. And women have chosen more mission-driven work, and often that means in nonprofits and in caretaking jobs where wages tend to not be as high, or some of their compensation comes in the form of benefits. None of that is taken into account when we look at the gender wage gap.
What does it tell us when you look at statistics indicating that when you compare average women's earnings to average men's earnings over the course of their career, they find that the women's earnings are similar to or even greater than men's earnings before parenthood, but then that changes after the birth of their first child? What does that tell us?
It tells us very clearly that when men and women have similar preferences early on in their careers, just coming out of college, for example, we especially see young women, college educated in major metropolitan areas, now out earning men, sometimes by 2 digits. And once women have children, they're more likely to reduce their hours, and that is reflected in their earnings because they work fewer hours. They might even step down from a higher responsibility job to taking on something that allows them to spend more time with their children. All of that has an impact. But when men and women choose the same pathways, we find that those discrepancies disappear. Again, preferences are also need to be taken into account in terms of the industries that women choose.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time's expired.
Thank you, Senator Lee, very much. We'll now move on, I believe, to Senator Heinrich. But in passing, I just want to point out that Denmark was just rated the second happiest country in the world in Gallup. So they seem to be doing some things pretty well. Senator Heinrich?
Thank you for that, Chairman. Dr. Holder, I wanted to ask you about this idea that you would almost believe from some of the conversation here that you can't do statistically valid research in this area because there are all these hidden choices being made, that you can't get to an apples comparison. You do a lot of research in this area. Obviously, you have to control for different variables. Can you talk to us about your view of what an apples to apples comparison looks like?
Sure, thank you for that question. As an economist, I am trained in techniques which will, when I am trying to compare outcomes between two groups, I can control for certain variables that might influence the outcome. So for example, in my research where I compared Black working women, full-time working women, and non-Hispanic white full-time working men, some of the variables, that's economics lingo, forgive me for that, but some of the variables that would contribute to a gender wage gap would include things like age, work experience, educational attainment, whether they are married, whether the worker is married, whether the worker has children, whether the worker has small children, where does the worker live. So in my research, I use several methodologies which control for the very things that would contribute to the gender wage gap. And even given that, I still find a differential between, in my research, white full-time working men and Black full-time working women that cannot be explained by having children, that cannot be explained by a difference in educational attainment, that cannot be explained by work experience, length of work experience. All of those things have been taken into account. And what I still find is that after all of those contributing factors, which might explain why a white male would earn more than a Black female in the same occupation, given the same characteristics, that I've taken that into account. And in fact, in my research, I used 3 different methodologies, and the final methodology is actually a really sophisticated one that pairs white men and Black women with very similar characteristics in the same occupations, and there is still a differential in pay that cannot be ascribed to anything else but biased treatment.
Thank you, Dr. Holder. And Ms. Pugh, I want to ask you, we heard one of our panelists question, is there a problem here at all? I'd love to get your perspective on that. And then the issue of, if only women were better negotiators, all of this might go away.
2 things. On the negotiation front, in the domestic work context, there is no job security, no clear agreements or contracts, and therefore, in attempting to negotiate for something as simple as a sick day, you risk losing your job. And so what we hear time and time again is pervasive fear of asking for something as simple as an afternoon off to go to your child's PTO meeting, to a raise, an annual raise. And people won't do it because they will risk losing their jobs. They lack the power to negotiate in the workplace. And secondly, this idea that women are choosing lower paid work because benefits and other forms of compensation exist. That is just simply not true for this entire sector of care work. Wages are low and benefits are virtually non-existent.
And in your view, would the Paycheck Fairness Act make these inherent discrepancies better or worse for women in these positions?
I think that would make them better.
Transparency seems to be a fundamental issue here. Dr. Kim, do you think that there is power, and even power with respect to negotiation, in that transparency?
Absolutely. If you know what other people are being paid, you can negotiate better. But I want to say something about that as well. If women try to negotiate, often they're not hired because they're seen as too aggressive. So women are really viewed and treated differently than men. It's not that we don't negotiate as well as men. And also, if the studies that do find women start out equal to men, 5 years later, they're not. And it's not because they have kids, it's because they're not trained or promoted or mentored.
Yeah.
So again, different treatment is another big explanation. And finally, I just wanted to add to the earlier discussion that, like Dr. Holder said, our research controls for hours worked, productivity, even preferences, and you still find a gender wage gap. It's really different treatment, subtle biases, and the government should have policies so that this kind of discrimination can't continue.
Thank you for holding this hearing, Chairman Byers. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator, very much. Now let me recognize my friend from Arizona, Congressman Schweiker.
All right, I assume we can hear me now. Sorry about that. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually fascinated with this subject, and Don, you and I should have a side conversation because I think we're actually, in both the witnesses that have been chosen and some of the narrowcast, we've missed some of the point, some of the generational changes that are happening. But also, I fear we should be also talking about the working poor even more and some of the dynamics there because of the bleeding effect. So I want to walk through just a couple quick questions. Doctor, and forgive me if I mispronounce the name, Bachu, help me there.
I think it's Bacha, David. Yeah. David, we lost your audio again.
Okay, am I back at all?
Yes,
Okay, can you hear me now?
yes.
All right, sorry about that. I'm having to do this on an iPhone because my iPad crashed on me, believe it or not. So we're doing a little juggling here. I sat down with a ASU grad student. She was a quant, which is rather neat. And we were actually talking about adjustments. And this would be interesting also for Dr. Holder. And she was actually fixated on the number of adjustments that you would make and looking for adjustments that were not traditionally in the literature of this subject. And one I still remember, driving distances. Males being willing to drive further distances for this similar position, and then she actually tried to build a level of confidence. You know, for those of us in the political world, we would, consider it your polling variance. There's no question her final numbers, there was an income differential between males and females. I was surprised how small it was. If I came to you and asked you to build these tables, how many different adjustments would you look to, that term ceteris paribus, the differentials between males and females and trying to create that ultimate adjustment? She was up, I think, approaching 60 different adjustments. What should the literature actually have?
I think this is a very interesting question, and I don't have a numeric answer for you, but what I do know is that there are unexplained factors that we have not yet been able to measure, and I applaud the student that you just talked with about this, trying to explain more of those. We also found a very similar result in looking at Uber drivers, male and female Uber drivers, and some of the explanatory factors there were how late those drivers were willing to drive. Men were more likely to drive at night when there was surge pricing. They were more likely to drive longer distances, and they had a longer experience, more tenure as Uber drivers, all of which raised their pay. So there are unexplained factors, and even during the Obama administration, the Labor Department did a very extensive study and identified that between 3 and 5% was unexplained after accounting for simple factors, and then you can get more complicated, but we have not yet found a comprehensive set of measures that we should be considering.
And look, we have the tyranny of the clock. Dr. Holder, if you ever, I've actually had, and forgive me for not being disciplined enough, I've been reading some of because I know you've worked very hard in trying to model all this. I may send, with your permission, I may send you a couple notes with some geeky stuff asking how you would adjust this. I was a failed, person who thought he could do statistics. Ms. Poe, I actually have one quick one with my last couple minutes here. Thank you for representing the workers you do, but my understanding, and we've been looking at the numbers of what happens, particularly to the working poor, also in the professions you're looking at, and what we were seeing was population dynamics. If you have lots of workers with very moderate to low skill sets vying for jobs in certain urban areas, we saw a wage depression, the deflation. If we look at 2018-19, when there was a tremendous demand in our economy for those with what we'll call moderate skill sets. And I'm trying to find the nice way to say those things. We saw dramatic increases. I mean, think of African American women in 2019 and 18. The chart just blows off the chart. I have an intense concern what's happening with immigration right now, particularly being from Arizona. Do you see a suppression of workers' wages in the skill set you represent when you add potentially 1 million folks to the US economy with similar skill sets?
Well, what I can say is that there's a huge demand, for example, for personal care aides for the growing aging population. We have 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 per day and people living longer than ever before. 90% of Americans, according to AARP, right?
But that's actually not. We understand the population side, 10,300 a day, turning 65. But it's still a dynamic of scarcity, that moves the value of that labor. When you're in those categories, you're selling your labor.
Mm-hmm.
And when you add dramatic population increases with similar skill sets, you devalue their labor. And we have some great charts and statistics that have been looking at this over the last decade. My latest math is it's going to take 7 years for the working poor just to get the income back up for just what's happened so far in the last fiscal year at our border.
I think what I was trying to
I'm
say.
surprised I don't hear more of that.
Well, what I was trying to say is that we have such a huge demand for elder care in the home and community that it doesn't actually, according to your logic, make sense that the average annual income is $18,000 per year for this workforce.
Oh, no, I'm with you. I believe this is a population that's underpaid. I have a fixation on working poor and what we do to make them less poor.
Mm-hmm.
And almost all the proposals do not actually help that population. They sound great on a brochure, but there's no math that says they help the working poor. And with that, Mr. Baier, thank you. I yield back.
Okay, it's become a bigger discussion. But now, talking about big discussions, let me recognize the senator from Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I know there's some new staff that was introduced at the beginning, but I wanted to particularly congratulate Tamara Facile. She used to work for me many, many years ago, and I know she'll do a fantastic job for you as the staff director. I wanted to start with Dr. Holder. There you are. I think one of the things this pandemic has shed such a big magnifying glass on is just this difficulty for so many parents of balancing everything. And I always have this image of moms balancing their toddlers on their knees and their laptops on their desk, and dads teaching their second graders how to use a mute button, which they do better than any of our senators, honestly. My question is, I did this Marshall Plan for moms, which of course part of this is paid leave. And we really haven't done enough in this area in Congress, and we have this possibility coming up in the next few months. Can you talk about how a paid leave policy could have helped during the pandemic, but also how it would help in the future to help address the gender wage gap?
Well, thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Such a pleasure to answer a question from you about the gender wage gap. I did spend a lot of time last year writing and talking about how working mothers in particular were affected by the pandemic. And one of the issues was the inability of some women who were required to work on site, their inability to actually do that because their children were learning from remotely. They were doing school from home. And so inevitably, some women who were primarily single parents were unable to fulfill the expectations of their jobs because they had to be home to care for their children. So a paid leave policy, and might I just add, more affordable childcare availability will be such a benefit to working women when we think about the fact that 1/3 of women who work in this country are mothers. And so we need to do everything we can to support these workers. And I wouldn't necessarily limit that to working women. I would say if a dad is a single parent, has caregiving responsibilities, these types of policies would benefit him as well. So I feel in this country, we haven't paid enough attention to the needs of working parents. And I think that the pandemic really exposed what their vulnerabilities are, what their needs are, and what's required so they can be full participants in the American work life. And absolutely, paid leave would go very, very far in helping working parents as well as affordable childcare.
Very good. Thank you for that great answer. Ms. Pooh, and this is kind of plays off what Dr. Holder was talking about here on the child care issue. I mean, we know, again, another big magnifying glass during the pandemic about the issue child care. And especially actually Senator Sullivan and I have a bipartisan bill on helping to train more workers, trying to address the shortage of affordable child care. And so part of it's training, but a lot of it is wages to try to attract people to this occupation. So it's the double whammy is there's not enough childcare, and then we don't have enough people working in it. And then if they're not paid enough, we're not going to get them to work in it. And so could you talk about, we have these literal childcare deserts in some of the rural areas of my state where we would actually be able to add jobs and there's employers out there. Could you talk, Ms. Pooh, about some policy solutions we should consider when it comes to increased pay for domestic workers, how we do that while still making childcare affordable? And the same kind of chicken and egg thing in the wages, making it affordable, and then also making sure we have the supply.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator Klobuchar, for your leadership on so many of these issues that are about equity and opportunity for women. There is a whole series of investments that we need to make in making childcare, quality childcare, much more affordable and accessible to American families. And the American Families Plan that the president has put forward and some parts of the American Jobs Plan begin to make those investments. And I know there are a number of childcare bills in Congress that are about making childcare much more affordable and accessible. And I think that childcare funding at the federal level should also be tied to rate setting and insurance that we are also raising the wages for childcare workers. What I see is that we end up losing some of our best care workers and care providers and early childhood educators to other low-wage service jobs because they simply can't make ends meet doing this work, despite the fact that they see it as their calling. So raising the wages, improving access to benefits would be huge for this workforce.
Right, exactly. And I would think figuring out how to help fund some of it so that you can still have it be affordable.
Exactly.
Raising the wages. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just went a little bit over my time. I'm not,
That's okay, Senator.
allow others to go. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I
Right.
now recognize the senator from Texas, Senator Cruz. If you are with us. Great, thanks, Senator. Floor is yours.
I am here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses here today. I want to address my initial question to Ms. Baccia. Yesterday, the Senate voted on the Paycheck Fairness Act. And existing federal law prohibits sex-based wage discrimination, quite rightly. But proponents of this bill say that it's necessary to close what they call the gender wage gap. You had previously written about the Paycheck Fairness Act and the gender wage gap. Can you please explain, in your judgment, what are the real causes of the wage disparity and whether that disparity is caused primarily by discrimination?
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I have been writing about the Paycheck Fairness Act and the gender wage gap for over a decade, and I am very concerned by the provisions in the law that they would not, in fact, help women, but they would have the exact opposite effect. However, there are several provisions that would be welcomed by trial lawyers, including unlimited liability and the potential for unlimited punitive damages that could be imposed on employers, even if we don't have evidence that the differential between what women and men get paid is due to discrimination, but due to a variety of explanatory factors. And that's where other provisions of the Paycheck Fairness Act, including some that seem innocuous, like the Department of Labor collecting data based on what people get paid based on their race and gender and other protected factors. It may seem like that kind of transparency wouldn't be an issue, but what we have found is that it seems to indicate that there is a problem where there isn't necessarily one unless we have more data that explains where those differences come from. And what we find is that when we account for measurable explanatory factors, the gender wage gap all but disappears, and even the small unexplained gap is not necessarily due to discrimination, but due to a variety of factors that we aren't measuring. That is not to say that there isn't a single individual in our economy that at times suffers discrimination due to bias or other factors, and there we already have legal protections in place. We do not need the Paycheck Fairness Act. I think it would do more harm than good. But more importantly than that, because lawsuits, I don't think are a good option. It's a very lengthy option, a very time-consuming option, a very tough option, and not an affordable option for many workers. That still the best opportunities we can provide is to have a strong economy that allows for entrepreneurship, so that individuals, especially women, benefit greatly from being able to run their own businesses, set their own hours, so they can create the work-life balance that works best for them. But also for men, entrepreneurship is key to create jobs in our economy, and that's where we should focus instead of increasing liability on employers, which would most likely result in lower pay for both men and women, as employers have to recoup the costs of the higher insurance that the Paycheck Fairness Act would impose on them.
So, Ms. Baccia, one thing you said that was particularly troubling is you said that in your expert judgment, this legislation, if it were passed into law, would harm women and decrease the employment options for women in the workplace. Can you explain that, please?
Yes, I think one of the very first things it would do is it would encourage employers to adopt more rigid pay structures. So the private sector would look more closely to a unionized work environment. A comparative worth regime is another way of looking at it, because so many of the differences that we can't easily explain in the wages between men and women that arise from things such as different negotiation tactics, women choosing to work fewer hours, different hours, requesting more flexibility, and for employers to make that available is so important. Those things would go away first, because it would be hard for employers to potentially explain that those aren't a business necessity, and they could be subject to undue lawsuits that would be very costly. I also think it could potentially hurt women's potential to be hired in the first place, because it makes us a greater statistical liability for the employer due to those factors. So I think it would hurt women's ability to participate in the workforce, and would also hurt their ability to negotiate the kinds of working conditions, including reduced hours, more flexibility, working from home occasionally, that is so important to them.
Well, thank you. Now, look, I do agree that we should be concerned about wage growth. And we actually saw under the previous administration, with Republican-controlled majorities in both houses, a staggering record of record low unemployment, the lowest unemployment in half a century, the lowest unemployment for African Americans ever recorded, the lowest unemployment for Hispanics ever recorded, the lowest unemployment for Asian Americans ever recorded. We also saw women in poverty decreasing by $1.5 million. And compared to President Obama's second term, we saw wage growth growing 60% faster for women than it did under President Obama's second term. Ms. Baccia, what policies implemented by President Trump and the Republican Congress contributed to that record low unemployment and that wage growth that women saw across the country?
Yeah, our most vulnerable populations, including working women and also minorities and individuals with disabilities, benefit most from a booming economy. And one of the major policies implemented by the Trump administrations were the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I think that had an impact, but it was also a huge regulatory reduction in the burden that employers were facing, that entrepreneurs were facing. Regulation and red tape is a huge burden for workers and employers, and the Trump administration reduced that significantly, which is why I think we saw such a strong economy.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, thank you very much. Let's now move on to our new senator from Georgia, Senator and Reverend Warnock. Floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Chairman Baier. A Bureau of Labor Statistics study found that working women, particularly women of color, have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic that is now being called a she-cession, as more than 11 million women lost their jobs and accounted for 55% of all job losses in April. Even in my home state of Georgia, we have seen increased job loss among women, with women filing 15% more in unemployment claims than men between April and November of 2020. Further, state budget cuts and furloughs have disproportionately impacted women. This disparity will cause long-term damage and have consequences beyond our economy, spilling into housing, instability, food insecurity, and the well-being of our children. This she-cession, combined with the already large racial wage gap that Black and brown women suffer from, a double gap, which you've written about, Dr. Holder, has proven disastrous for future wage growth for Black and brown women. So disparities and the history of disparity adds upon layer of disparity. Dr. Holder, in your testimony, you mentioned prohibiting employers from requesting previous salary history as a possible solution. Why would this be a good policy for women in Georgia and all across the country?
Thank you, Senator and Reverend Warnock. It's a pleasure to answer a question from you on this issue. So the issue of why prohibiting employers from requesting previous salary histories would contribute to narrowing the gender wage gap, let me explain it this way. We do know that there is a gender wage gap. We may disagree on what the contributing factors are. But if you have two applicants for a job, one a man and one a woman, with very similar characteristics, similar educational attainment, similar work experience, similar age, perhaps they are both parents, perhaps they are not. The issue is, because of the gender wage gap, the likelihood that the female applicant's salary history will show a history of much lower earnings than the male applicant is simply why requesting previous salary histories has a disparate impact on female applicants for jobs. Women are simply, we earn on average less than men, we know that. And so if you have two candidates that are similarly qualified, a man and a woman, and you look at their salary histories that they supply as requested, the likelihood is the female candidate will have a salary history that shows lower wages than the male applicant.
So being underpaid rather than skill and experience becomes a basis for being underpaid, and underpaid in the past, underpaid in the future. Ms. Kim, or Dr. Kim, I should say, or Ms. Pooh, either of you want to add to this? Thank you so much. Look,
I agree with what Dr. Holder said.
I do as well. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much. And you know, we're all waiting with bated breath each month when these job numbers come out. But just to get the job numbers alone doesn't tell the whole story. We should ask, what do these numbers look like for women? And are these jobs providing equitable and livable wages for women? What do these numbers look like for women of color? And which is why yesterday I was deeply disappointed that our colleagues on the other side were unwilling to even have a real debate about this, about the wage gap and the Paycheck Fairness Act, that we couldn't have an honest debate. I thought that's what we were here for, about this issue, how to unleash an economy that is fair, transparent, and equitable. And so we've got to work together to do what we can to get equal pay in this country. I'm sorry, Dr. Kim.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I only found out about that vote at the beginning of this meeting. So, but I do want to say that transparency and accountability has shown to reduce the wage gap, because employers look at their practices and make sure they're not discriminatory. So it would be a positive thing to have transparency and accountability. But thank you.
Thank all of you. Thank you for your work in this space. Thank you, Brother Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warnock, very much. I know yesterday's vote was disappointing, but it goes back to the fundamentally anti-democratic character of the filibuster, which is not included in our Constitution and never intended by our founding fathers and mothers. But with that, let me turn to my dear friend from Wichita and fellow Ways and Means Board member, committee member, Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Beyer, and thank you to all our witnesses for joining us today. You know, America is known as a land of opportunity. You know, for centuries, men and women have flocked to the country because of the freedoms that allow them the opportunity for a better life and ability to provide for their families. When it comes to earning a living, both men and women make decisions about their employment. They look at the job opportunities and choose careers and industries based on their priorities and values. Some Americans prioritize flexibility in the workplace. Others reject jobs that are dangerous, and some want to ensure they have the ability to reach their earnings potential. As we talk today about the gender gap, the gender pay gap, we shouldn't consider these numbers in a vacuum, nor should we assume we know all the factors an individual may choose as a priority. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that women worked 10% fewer hours than men in 2020. And a Harvard study further concluded that women have greater demand for workplace flexibility and lower demand for overtime hours work than men. Some estimates have the pay gap at 3 to 5% after accounting for these real world factors, and even just a 2% controlled pay gap in a recent report from payscale.com. As we consider the best policies for our country, we need to include all of the data and not just what fits a particular political narrative. With that in mind, and considering a much smaller adjusted pay gap, I would encourage my colleagues to seek solutions that promote economic growth for men and women. Legislation like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 focused on expanding opportunities for all Americans, helping families keep more of their hard-earned money, growing our economy like we've never seen before, and encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation. And in a short time, the TCJA took the year-to-year earnings growth for all workers that had been hovering around 2.5% to an average of 3%, and it was peaking at 3.5%. And on top of that, record low unemployment for women. That's right, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act resulted in record low unemployment rate for women in more than 65 years. Unfortunately, the pandemic has had consequences for all Americans. And because of the far-reaching shutdown measures taken by some governors and school unions refusing to let students return to in-person classroom, the progress made by women through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did experience a setback. And due to forced school and child care closures, we saw women across the country reduce their work hours or leave the workforce entirely to care for their children. for many, they had no other options. But now with the vaccinations up and the cases down, our country's returning to normal. We need to make sure that we focus on pro-growth pro-growth economic opportunities. Mrs. Bacha, as I mentioned, women experienced wage growth and opportunities under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What effect do you think that rolling back these policies would have on working women and their pay?
I think it would have very negative effects, not just on working women, but on all vulnerable populations and populations that have special needs. And the discussions we're having today over new mandates, more government regulation to address a perceived gender wage gap that has not been fully explained, and where we can't just ascribe it to discrimination, but many other factors are at play. The unintended consequences are also creating uncertainty today, even if those mandates and regulations don't go into effect immediately. Us talking about them and the political direction that the country has taken does impose that uncertainty on employers, which makes them less likely to expand their businesses, which means fewer job opportunities and fewer jobs for these populations. And the more jobs that our economy can provide and the higher quality jobs that it can provide, the greater negotiating power working women will have, as well as other vulnerable populations. So that's why we should focus, and I couldn't agree more with you, on restoring that pro-growth economy that provides that certainty so businesses will expand and create those job opportunities for all Americans.
I think the best way, obviously, to build wealth for working women is to provide greater opportunities, more economic choices, and to get Washington out of the way, and so that we can return back to the booming economy we had before the pandemic. I know I'm really short on time. I didn't know in your opening comments, Mrs. Bacha, you made some mention about you immigrated here because of the American dream. And now that we know pay gaps in other countries, United States pretty similar to Canada and Finland and the UK. Are there policies in particular that it seems like there's not a big difference, but in the United States we still have a better economic growth and better opportunities?
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree with that, and I love this country because it provides opportunities for everyone. And I come from Germany, where we have very generous paid leave policies, and they have backfired on women in Germany. They're spending more time out of the labor force. They have more prolonged career interruptions, and women are less likely to be in managerial positions. And I am very happy and privileged to be in a managerial position as a woman, and for the opportunities that this country has provided to me.
Well, great, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. And now let me recognize the senator from Arizona, Senator Kelly, for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for having this committee hearing today. So Dr. Kim, in Arizona, on average, women make 84 cents for every dollar that a man makes. And if you break that down and compare median earnings of women and men, Black women make 63% of what the average white man makes, and Latinas, just 51%, and that's unacceptable. Last night, we voted to consider the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would help address this by ensuring employers can't compensate workers differently based on sex. Also, preventing companies from retaliating against workers who talk about how much money they make, and making it illegal for employers to ask about salary history when hiring. So, Dr. Kim, could you speak to the impact of this legislation in Arizona and across the United States?
I think there were a lot of very good things in that legislation, including outlawing pay secrecy, as you say. So you can't be fired if you ask what other people make. As I said earlier, accountability and transparency reduces the gender wage gap, not only in setting pay, but in performance appraisals, which gives merit pay to people all the way down the line. I think collecting data to see if there's a problem is absolutely important because, and other countries are doing this as well. And so I think this legislation would have been a step forward for women and all employees across the country in reducing the gender wage gap and racial wage gaps as well. So I was very much in favor of it, and I'm sorry it did not pass. And unlike what people have been saying, you know, part of the gender wage gap obviously is because some women may work fewer hours and may take time off to take care of their families. But when you control for all of these things, you'll find that women attending the same college in the same major, the same GPA, earn less than men. And why is that? I mean, there's these biases. I mean, if you look at a piece, if you have a piece of artwork and you put a woman's name on that, and then you change it so that there's a man's name on it, it's ranked lower in quality when a woman's name is there. If you have a dossier with a resume and research, and you put a woman's name on it, they're less likely to be hired. They're less likely to get tenure with the exact same job history and work than men are. Then if you put a man's name on that work, we can't get any clearer than this. Women are treated differently. I don't think people mean to do that. There's just implicit bias, and our work is undervalued. So, and both men and women discriminate. Both men and women have these biases. You could go online and take an implicit bias test, an implicit race test. And I think in order to remedy this, we need policies to ensure that employers are not underpaying women and that they're hiring, training, and promoting in their representative numbers. So
Dr. Kim, what do you think would have, if this legislation or something like it was signed into law? We're talking about 84 cents on the dollar, women compared to men, 63 cents for Black women, 51 for Latinas. What do you think those numbers would have been if this legislation or legislation like it would be signed into law?
Well, in my own research finds that if you outlaw pay secrecy, the gender wage gap goes down. So, and then if you enforce non-discrimination laws, if the agencies have more ability to investigate and discrimination or potential discrimination, I think could get pretty close to parity. I mean, I think this would be a really good thing to pass.
Yeah, so you're seeing the possibility of, I mean, if we went from 84 cents to, let's say, close to, parity, that is upwards of about a 25 or so percent, actually a little less than that, but it's a significant pay raise for women.
Well, let me just back off. The 80% is unadjusted for work hours and your occupation and everything else. If this were passed and the minimum wage were raised, I think we could get close to parity when you adjust for those factors. Will the wage gap be by then? I don't know, maybe 95%. If you don't adjust for that, but I think we could get close if we just, if we can, again, enforce non-discrimination, collect data, and make federal contractors accountable.
Well, thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim and Mr. Chairman. Apologize for going over on my time a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, very much. And now our grand finale is the immediate past chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, dear friend from Wisconsin. Congressman Pocan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your patience. All three of my hearings today, including one that started this morning, I was up within 10 minutes of each other. So this has been an interesting, maybe it's lucky and I should go to a casino this afternoon, but glad to be here. Thank you. I did get the chance to hear almost all the opening testimony in middle of these hearings. Let me ask some questions specifically around minimum wage and the gender gap, because we have the Raise the Wage Act that passed through the House last session, again, this session. How does the federal minimum wage impact the gender wage gap specifically, and specifically also for women of color? If you could address those questions around the minimum wage.
Well, certainly for domestic workers and care workers who earn less than or on average between $10 and $12 per hour, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would be transformative. And it's worth noting that 2/3 of all minimum wage workers are women, in fact, and women are disproportionately concentrated in jobs where wages are low and there's no benefits, no job security. And so raising the minimum wage and providing that baseline of economic security would be transformative, certainly for domestic workers and care workers, but I think across the low-wage economy for women.
Anyone else want to address that? Yeah, how about specifically the tipped wage? I mean, I've been an employer for 32 years. I have never understood how you can, for a couple dollars an hour, hire someone and act almost as if they're independent contractors because they're going to make money on tips. And often that doesn't compensate for what the wage they should be making for their time. And yet they're still basically under the direction of those jobs of the employers, even at that incredibly low wage. Do you have any statistics on gender gap specifically around that sub minimum, that tipped wage? Ms. Pu, please.
Well, I should say for sure that the tipped minimum wage creates a tremendous amount of vulnerability for women workers in the workforce, in the service economy. And there's a lot of data that Rock United and the One Fair Wage campaign have generated that talks about the reliance of women on tips to earn what should be a base wage. Leads to more vulnerability to sexual harassment in the workplace, and all kinds of other problems that further exacerbate gender inequality in the workplace. So I think raising the minimum wage and eliminating the tip minimum wage, and also the sub minimum wage for people with disabilities, so that we actually have one solid floor for every American worker upon which to build real economic security from. I think it's essential to our economic recovery.
Great. And then let me ask about also another bill that we passed for the last two sessions called the PRO Act. That would specifically allow people to be able to organize in a much easier way. Right now, there's an awful lot of obstacles to people who actually get to having an election to form unions, but there's many advantages to the employers. If we pass the PRO Act, what kind of effect would that have based on gender equity in pay? Ms. Kim?
I will answer your first question first because I just unmuted. I actually am looking at the minimum wage, the effect on the wage gap. And so far I found that if you increased it to $14.50 an hour, I didn't even do $15 an hour. It would mean either a 5 or an 8-point decline in the gender wage gap. So it would have an effect. In terms of unionization, I mean, women want to be in unions and they are low paid, and making it easier for people to be in unions would definitely increase the pay. The pay for workers increases between like 10 to 30%, depending on where you are. It has a huge effect. So that would be helpful as well.
Great. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman. I see there's 4 seconds, so I'm going to yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan, very much. Well, that concludes us today. And I want to thank each of our witnesses for this lively discussion. We made important strides in advancing the conversation about the gender wage gap, how we value women's work, the solutions to improve it. As we discussed today, there's no single solution to close the gender wage gap, although you did offer many very good constructive solutions. And I believe, at least, that the persistence of the gap harms women's economic security and our economy's strength and growth. And I believe Congress must continue to work to narrow it and close it. I will say, I believe my friend Mr. Estes has been an employer, and certainly Mr. Pocan was. When I left the family business to run for Congress, we had 330 people over 45 years and always committed to equal pay. I confess I never saw a loss of flexibility or how it restricted choices for any of those people. Now, with my personal staff on the Hill and the Joint Economic Committee, more than half of those wonderful people are women. Again, they're among the most highest paid people we have. I've never, again, seen how it restricted their choices of their flexibility. And on comparable worth, there may be a downside to comparable worth. The upside is the perception of fairness. And what we're dealing with right now is an enormous gap in the perception of fairness between men and women. So I want to thank both of our economists, Dr. Holder, Dr. Kim, for helping us understand the underlying causes of the gender wage gap, how it's changed over time, how deeply you work to root out and make sure that we really are comparing apples to apples. And of course, developing policies that can help us ensure that women are compensated fairly for their work. And I'm sure we didn't have a chance to go into all of Senator Cruz's comments about the best wages, which was, I believe, accurate. But we look and see consistent wage growth every year from 2010 through today, month after month after month, as we continue to build this economy through Democratic and Republican presidents. And thank you to our advocate organizer, Ms. Pooh, for offering deep insight into one sector of work dominated by female workers, especially women of color. And your insight into how care work can serve as a lens for understanding how to improve the working and economic conditions of some of the lowest paid and most valuable workers in our economy. And one of the economy's fastest growing sectors is really valuable to so many policy discussions. We can get that right. And thank you to Ms. Baccia, a double George Mason graduate in my district, for offering your perspective and other factors to consider on this topic. And thank you for talking about the potential unintended consequences we always have to be mindful of. And sharing this wonderful committee. This important work.
I'm having trouble hearing.
So
I am as well.
I'm sorry, it seems we have